Welcome to our second video of Fur Trade Paddling School. Today, Jim and Doreen will explain the 1967 Centennial Canoe Race and its importance in detail for you. Take it away, Jim and Doreen.
Hello everybody. This is video number 2 in a series of 6, and we're talking about the 1967 canoe race. It's the longest canoe race in the world, and it took place in Canada. The race started right here at the National Historic Park near Rocky Mountain House. It was called the 1967 Centennial Canoe Pageant. We're standing in front of the pavilion that houses the Alberta team's canoe. And on this pavilion, not only do we have the original canoe that went across Canada, one of the 10, but we have a map showing the provinces that the voyageurs went through, from Alberta all the way to Montreal. And then here they have a plaque that tells about the times that the paddlers took going across Canada. Manitoba, who won the race, came in 531 hours. And then the last one was Nova Scotia that came in 566 hours. That's not much difference when you consider they paddled 3,283 miles. With all the activities being planned for Canada's 150th birthday, it will be easy for you to imagine the excitement in Canada at the thought of celebrating the 100th birthday, or the Centennial. Planning began years ahead, but the big question was, what would be the best way to have the celebration that would depict our 100 years of history? The government was coming up with all kinds of ideas, like caravans and trains that would be outfitted specially to depict our history and could be taken across Canada for people in all provinces to see. But they're still looking for ideas. So who came up with the best idea of all? Paddlers, of course. Flin Flon, Manitoba was the hub of canoe racing in those days, and one of the members of Parliament was Jean Riom, who was on a visit to Flin Flon in 1962. He got to talking with paddlers Jim Riom and John Nicol and came up with the idea, what else? A canoe race, of course. But how could they make the canoe race really special? What if they raced across Canada on the old fur trade route from Rocky Mountain House way over here all the way to Montreal to be at Expo in time for the Expo 67? They invited the Centennial Commissioner, John Fisher, to Flin Flon to hear their idea. John Nicol was a good persuader, and before the end of the visit, Fisher gave the go-ahead for a $1 million project with John Nicol in charge. It was decided that they would try to get each province and territory to sponsor a team in the race so that it would be truly a Canadian race. In the end, 8 provinces and 2 territories became involved in the project. Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island chose to do other Centennial projects.
One of the next problems was to find a canoe to do the job. What canoe could stand the hard work of racing across Canada, down rivers that could be rocky fast, narrow, have many rapids and waterfalls, scraping and banging, thumping, being lifted, big lakes and boggy areas? As the project was going to be a voyageur canoe pageant, reenacting the fur trade and its voyageurs, it was thought that the canoe should be styled after the North canoes that were used in the fur trade by the Hudson's Bay and Northwest companies. 1838, Francis Hopkins, one of the Canadian iconic pictures. Specifications for these voyageur canoes was researched and then modifications made until they figured they had a canoe that would work for the Centennial race. Took 3 tries. The famous Canadian and fabulous Chestnut Canoe Company was then asked to build 11 wood and canvas canoes. 3 trial races were needed to test not only these canoes, but the food, equipment, and paddles before the 1967 race. After all, this was now a federally funded project, and it wouldn't look good to have something go wrong with it all. With all of Canada watching, the first trial race was from North Bay to Kingston, Ontario. The next in central BC from Fort St. James all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The third trial race saw them paddling from Montreal down the Hudson River to New York City to invite the Americans to Expo 67. Yes, in the old days you paddled from Montreal to New York. These trial races made them realize they needed stronger canoes to handle the needs of the race. These new canoes were made of the revolutionary new material at the time, fiberglass. They were 8 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, 1.5 meter deep, and weighed 140 kilograms. 25 feet long, 4 feet wide, 18 inches deep, and weighed 370 pounds, or two of me. The canoes were all named after famous Canadian explorers like David Thompson, Simon Fraser, and Pierre La Vérendrye. Getting the provinces and territories to sponsor them was a huge project because they all had their demands. For instance, the Manitoba government wanted the canoe pageant to be on the lawn at their parliament buildings on July 1st. The BC government didn't want to sponsor a team because the race was not in BC, and Ontario wanted the teams to be in Kenora by July 10th. The bottom line was they needed to meet the federal government requirements of at least 10 teams before they would give the final go to the project. Fortunately, everything worked out.
100 voyageurs ended up being chosen for the 1967 Centennial Pageant. They came from across Canada, from all walks of life, but the thing that brought them together were the love of paddling, the thrill of being in the longest canoe race in recorded history, and the excitement of reenacting an important part of Canada's history. All of the paddlers were dedicated, experienced paddlers. Most of them were canoe racers, and they were in it to win. It was very competitive. 100 men, 10 from each team. How do you feed that many people? They told me this funny story. $3,000 worth of dried food was purchased. The first night of the first trial race, the voyageurs eagerly prepared the food and sat down to eat it. Yuck! The food tasted bad. It was like straw. The thought of eating this stuff for 104 days caused them to refuse to paddle unless something was done. A mutiny! Mr. Charbonneau, the commissioner for Expo 67, was along, and he and Mr. Nicol decided that the voyageurs could buy their own darn food. But then, what to do with the boxes and boxes of dried food? Well, that night, they came up with an idea. They loaded the food in a truck, drove it to the nearby dock, loaded it into a boat, and went out into the middle of the lake. They sat there in the moonlight, opening the bags of food and dumping them into Lake Simcoe. The fish probably weren't any happier with the food than the paddlers were. Many more logistics were worked out, such as safety, timing, communication, stops, sprint races at towns along the way, and much more. The problem of how to move team tents, food, and supplies from one spot to the next was solved by issuing each team with an army truck. As you can see, the planning and scheduling of this event was an enormous task. Of the 10-man teams, 6 would do the day's paddling, 3 would break camp and move to the next spot and set up camp, do laundry and that kind of thing, and 1 was the chief voyageur or team manager. 6 men paddling an 8-meter canoe in a race lasting 104 days required technique, skill, physical strength, endurance, mental strength, courage, training, practice, and just plain guts.
Each day's race was from 6 to 8 hours long and sometimes as long as 12 or 14. The canoe never stopped during this whole time. How did they paddle for that long efficiently? What did they do for eating, drinking, and bathroom breaks? I have raced those voyageur canoes with some of the 1967 paddlers, and in 2005 raced in those big canoes for 3 weeks across Saskatchewan on the Churchill River system. West border to east border, wild river, big waters, big rapids, big challenge. So how do you paddle these big boats? Well, if you look at these big seats, you have 1 man on each seat. So you can't paddle on one side for any longer than 10 paddle strokes, So otherwise you get yourself totally tired and worn out, and you have to change sides and change to the other side, and then you're fresh again, a whole new set of muscles. And you have to be kind of an acrobat and a bit of a gymnast and in incredibly good shape to be able to zip from one side of the canoe to the other and miss only one paddle stroke. The guy in the middle, as you can see here, had to be more of a gymnast than the rest. The people in the back and the front would keep on paddling, never miss a stroke. And if you're in the back of the canoe, as I was, then you not only have to steer the canoe, you have to paddle with everybody else. The person in the front has to set the pace, and everybody has to be totally, incredibly synchronized with him, or the canoe starts to fall down in the water and doesn't keep its speed going. The whole thing about paddling for this length of time is endurance. We practiced for 8 hours. We would paddle for 8 hours at 60 strokes a minute until we could do it beautifully, until we could do it efficiently, until we could do it with ease in terms of we could get out and do it again the next day. Some of the legs on our races again were 12 and 14 hours long, and it was in big waters, big lakes, sometimes huge waves. It was incredibly endurance based. 6 men could keep this canoe going very, very quickly, and it's such a feeling of elation when you get that whole thing working harmoniously and beautifully. It's such a feeling of strength. It's such a feeling of teamwork. We were proud to be able to do that.
In 1967, the Levi Jean Company issued 3 pairs of jeans to every paddler. The paddlers found that these lasted longer than other pants. As Jim explained, there was a long ways to slide across that canoe. Still, they could go through a pair of jeans in just a few days. Just try imagining yourself sliding across a 1.5 meter or 4 foot wide canoe seat at the rate of once every 10 seconds while performing a paddle stroke once every second. Can you imagine the friction? Can you imagine the wear and tear on those clothes? Can you imagine how all those 100 backsides felt at the end of a long day? There's much more to tell about this interesting and historic canoe race and pageant. One of the most important things about it was how it brought the history of the fur trade and the history of the canoe alive again. Another was that it pulled Eastern and Western Canada together in a countrywide Centennial project. John Nicholl said, "I think one of the most worthwhile aspects of the voyage was that we brought the Centennial to many small communities that would otherwise have had no Centennial project or event." I had the privilege of writing a book to tell the story of these Centennial voyageurs, the race and the pageant. And on the next video, we'll tell you some of the adventures and funny stories they told us about this 5,283 kilometer, 3,283 mile world's longest canoe race from Rocky Mountain House to Montreal. Don't miss it.